All right. So have you ever noticed how some like common sayings we use all the time,
Yep.
like
Mm.
turn the other cheek or go the extra mile, they actually come from one place,
Oh, yeah, for sure.
the Sermon on the Mount.
Absolutely.
And we're going to do a deep dive into it today. I
Awesome.
mean, this speech has been quoted and debated for centuries.
Yeah.
What's in it that's so powerful?
It's incredible how these words, from just chapters 5 through 7 of Matthew's gospel,
Yeah.
spoken on a mountainside all those years ago,
Right.
still resonate.
Exactly. And we're not just going to skim the surface.
Right.
We're going to unpack what Jesus said,
Yeah.
what it meant back then, and what it could mean for us today.
That setting itself is interesting.
Okay.
A mountainside.
Yeah.
It's a place of importance, even a bit dramatic,
Yeah.
but it's also accessible. It's not some exclusive ceremony.
Right.
This message is for everyone.
Yeah. And he starts with these blessings, the Beatitudes.
Yes.
But they're not your typical good luck kind of blessings. Like, blessed are those who mourn. Doesn't quite sound like a Hallmark card, does it?
Right. Blessed are the meek.
Yeah.
You don't hear that on a motivational poster,
No.
but that's where the depth comes in.
Okay.
Poor in spirit, for example,
Yeah.
isn't about lacking money. It's about humility.
Humility.
It's like realizing that we're not the center of the universe
Right.
and that maybe there's something bigger than ourselves we need to be connected to.
So could you say that in today's world where everyone's trying to climb the ladder
Yeah.
and build their brand,
Yeah.
that being poor in spirit could actually be an advantage?
It's a fascinating thought, isn't it?
Yeah.
Because if you think about it, humility allows for learning and growth.
Right.
It lets you connect with others in a more genuine way.
Okay.
Maybe in our world of constant self-promotion,
Yeah.
that's a real strength.
And then there's the meek shall inherit the earth bit,
Uh-huh.
not by force, right?
Right.
So how does that work?
It's not about weakness. Meekness, in this context, is about strength under control. It's about resilience and compassion.
Resilience and compassion.
Think of it like this in a workplace conflict. The loudest, most aggressive person doesn't always win.
Right.
Sometimes it's the one who can listen, stay calm, and find a solution that benefits everyone.
Interesting. So you've got humility, gentleness,
Yeah,
but then Jesus throws in this imagery of being salt and light.
right.
What's he getting at there?
He's calling his followers to be agents of change in the world.
Okay.
Think about it. Salt preserves, adds flavor.
Right.
Light dispels darkness.
Yeah.
He's saying you have a unique impact to make.
And this is important because he's not saying forget everything you've been taught.
Yeah.
He even says, do not think that I have come to abolish the law or the prophets. I've not come to abolish them, but to fulfill them.
Exactly. He's not starting from scratch.
Right.
He's building on existing Jewish tradition. It's like he's taking the core values and saying, let's go deeper. Let's focus on the spirit of the law, not just the letter.
Which brings us to some of the most challenging teachings of the Sermon on the Mount,
Yes.
where he seems to take common moral rules and crank them up a notch.
No, okay.
Like,
Yeah.
you have heard it said, do not murder.
Uh-huh.
But I tell you, whoever is angry with his brother.
That's where it gets really radical.
Okay.
He's shifting the focus from outward actions to inward attitudes.
Okay.
It's not enough to just avoid doing the bad thing.
Right.
You have to examine your heart, your motivations, your very thoughts.
So is he saying all anger is bad? I mean, we all get frustrated sometimes.
That's a question that's been debated for centuries.
Yeah.
But if you look at the context, the kind of anger Jesus is addressing is the kind that leads to hatred, contempt, the desire to harm.
So not like righteous anger in the face of injustice.
Exactly.
He's getting at what's at the root of our actions.
And then there's the whole love your enemies thing.
Yeah.
Honestly, that feels almost impossible sometimes. Yeah.
Especially in today's world, where people can be so cruel online.
It's one of the most misunderstood teachings.
Right.
It doesn't mean you condone someone's hurtful actions
Yes.
or become their best friend.
Right.
It's about choosing not to let hatred and bitterness take root in your heart.
So it's about protecting yourself in a way.
It is in a way, yeah.
Sure.
It's about maintaining your own inner peace and not letting someone else control your emotions.
So it's about rising above the negativity, not letting it drag you down.
Exactly. And recognizing their humanity even in the midst of conflict. Because often the people who hurt us are hurting themselves.
That's true.
Yeah.
Okay, but then right after these intense moral teachings,
Mm-hmm.
Jesus switches gears to something that seems almost contradictory.
Okay.
He tells people not to worry about material things.
Yeah.
But then he also says, seek first the kingdom of God.
Mm-hmm.
So which is it?
Right.
Should we be striving for something or letting go of everything?
That's where it gets interesting. I think he's getting at the idea of priorities.
Okay.
What are we truly seeking?
So what is this kingdom of God he keeps talking about?
Yeah.
Is it heaven? Some future utopia?
What if it's not about a physical place or a specific point in time?
Okay.
What if it's more about a way of being in the world?
All right.
A way of living that's characterized by love, justice, and peace.
So less about escaping this world and more about transforming it?
Yes.
But how do we do that?
Right.
Is it through grand gestures or just the little things we do every day?
That's the million-dollar question, isn't it?
Yeah.
The Sermon on the Mount doesn't give us a specific blueprint.
Okay.
It's more about applying these principles to our everyday lives and our relationships at work, even how we interact with strangers.
You know, it makes me think of that quote, be the change you wish to see in the world.
Yes.
It starts with each one of us.
Absolutely. And those choices, as small as they may seem, they ripple outwards.
Okay, so we've got inner transformation,
Yeah.
choosing love over hate, forgiveness over resentment,
Yeah.
generosity over greed. But that's easier said than done right,
Oh, yeah.
especially when the world seems to reward the opposite.
It definitely isn't easy.
Right.
And this is where that image of the narrow gate comes in again.
Okay.
Remember we talked about how it represents the difficult choices we have to make when we follow this path?
Right.
It's a constant process of resisting the temptation to take the easy way out, the selfish way out.
You know, it makes me think about my own life.
Yeah,
There are definitely times when I've chosen the wider, more comfortable path.
sure.
But there's also a part of me that longs for something more, something deeper.
That longing you're describing, I think that's the heart of what Jesus is getting at in the Sermon on the Mount.
Yeah.
It's a call to something bigger than ourselves, a call to a life of meaning and purpose.
It's almost like a radical way of life,
I think so.
a challenge to the status quo.
I think that's a great way to put it. It's
Yeah.
not about fitting in, it's about standing out. It's about being a beacon of hope in a world that so often seems dark and divided. But it's also a call to hope, isn't it?
Okay.
Because if enough of us can even begin to embody these teachings, maybe we can start to shift the tide.
Yeah. It's like imagine if everyone actually tried to live by the golden rule.
Right? What kind of world would that be?
Yeah,
It's a powerful thought.
it is.
And maybe that's the ultimate message of the Sermon on the Mount.
Okay.
It's a challenge to become more than we thought we could be,
Right.
to build our lives on a foundation of love and compassion.
Wow. We've covered a lot of ground already.
I know, right?
And there's still so much to explore.
Absolutely.
We'll be back in just a moment to continue our deep dive into the Sermon on the Mount.
Sounds good.
Don't go anywhere.
Yeah, stay tuned.
Welcome back to our deep dive into the Sermon on the Mount. It's incredible how much is packed into just a few chapters.
I know, right? We've talked about humility being agents of change and how Jesus really pushes the boundaries of traditional morality. But the big question is, how do we actually live this stuff out?
Yeah, exactly.
It all sounds great in theory, but how do we apply it to daily life?
Yeah, it's like, okay, I get the big ideas, but what does it look like to actually walk the walk?
That's where it gets tricky because the Sermon on the Mount isn't a step-by-step instruction manual.
Right.
It's more like a compass pointing us in the right direction,
Right.
but the terrain is up to us.
Okay, so we have our compass. What are some of the key landmarks we should be looking for on this journey?
One of the biggest is that focus on inner transformation that we talked about earlier.
Yeah.
Remember, Jesus keeps coming back to the state of our hearts, our motivations, even our thoughts.
So it's not just about checking off a list of good deeds. It's about becoming a certain kind of person from the inside out.
Exactly. It's about cultivating qualities like humility, compassion, forgiveness, and love.
Right.
And those aren't just nice ideas, they're practices.
Okay.
Habits of the heart that we need to develop over time.
I like that, habits of the heart. So is it like working out but for your soul?
There are definitely some similarities.
Okay.
Just like physical exercise strengthens our bodies, spiritual practices can strengthen our inner lives.
And what are some of those practices?
Well, prayer is a big one.
Okay.
Jesus actually gives his disciples a model prayer in the Sermon on the Mount, the one we know as the Lord's Prayer.
Yeah, I've said that prayer countless times,
Yeah.
but I've never really thought about its structure.
It's fascinating when you break it down.
Yeah.
It starts with acknowledging God's holiness, then moves into our needs, both physical and spiritual.
Okay.
And it ends with asking for forgiveness and help to resist temptation.
It's almost like a roadmap for aligning our will with God's will.
Exactly. And that alignment, that surrender to something bigger than ourselves,
Right.
is a key theme throughout the Sermon on the Mount.
Okay.
It all ties back to seeking first the kingdom of God, which can sound so abstract.
You mentioned the kingdom of God earlier, but what does that actually mean? Is it some far-off paradise we're supposed to be waiting for?
What if it's not about a physical location or a future event at all?
Okay.
What if it's a way of being in the world right now?
Yeah.
A way of living based on love, justice, and peace?
So less about escaping this world and more about transforming it. But how do we do that? Is it through grand gestures or just the little things we do every day?
That's the million-dollar question, isn't it?
Right.
The Sermon on the Mount doesn't give us a specific blueprint.
Right.
It's more about applying these principles to our everyday lives and our relationships at work, even how we interact with strangers.
You know, it makes me think of that quote, be the change you wish to see in the world.
Absolutely.
It starts with each one of us.
Absolutely. And those choices, as small as they may seem, they ripple outwards.
Okay, so it's about inner transformation, choosing love over hate, forgiveness over resentment, generosity over greed. But that's easier said than done, right?
Oh, yeah.
Especially when the world seems to reward the opposite.
It definitely isn't easy.
Right.
And this is where that image of the narrow gate comes in again. Remember we talked about how it represents the difficult choices we have to make when we follow this path?
Right.
It's a constant process of resisting the temptation to take the easy way out, the selfish way out.
You know, it makes me think about my own life. There are definitely times when I've chosen the wider, more comfortable path. But there's also a part of me that longs for something more, something deeper.
That longing you're describing, I think that's the heart of what Jesus is getting at in the Sermon on the Mount. It's a call to something bigger than ourselves, a call to a life of meaning and purpose.
It's almost like a radical way of life.
Yeah.
A challenge to the status quo.
I think that's a great way to put it. It's not about fitting in, it's about standing out.
Right.
It's about being a beacon of hope in a world that so often seems dark and divided. But it's also a call to hope, isn't it?
Yeah.
Because if enough of us can even begin to embody these teachings, maybe we can start to shift the tide.
Yeah, it's like imagine if everyone actually tried to live by the golden rule.
Right? What kind of world would that be? It's a powerful thought, and maybe that's the ultimate message of the Sermon on the Mount. It's a challenge to become more than we thought we could be, to build our lives on a foundation of love and compassion.
And even if we don't always get it right, even if we stumble along the way, the journey itself is transformative.
Exactly. We'll continue exploring that idea in just a moment as we wrap up our deep dive into the Sermon on the Mount. Stay with us.
Welcome back to the final part of our deep dive into the Sermon on the Mount. We've covered so much ground, from those surprising Beatitudes to the challenge of loving your enemies.
It's been a real journey, hasn't it? And I think what's stuck with me most is how Jesus keeps bringing it back to inner transformation.
Yeah.
That it's not enough to just go through the motions we have to really examine our hearts.
You know, it makes me think about how often I focus on outward actions, like checking things off my to-do list. But what if I approached those tasks with more of that inner focus? Would it change the way I interact with people?
What a great question. It reminds me of the time I was struggling with a colleague at work.
Okay.
I was so focused on how to win the argument that I completely missed the opportunity to understand their perspective.
Right.
It wasn't until I took a step back and asked myself, what's really going on here? What's driving their behavior? That I was able to approach the situation with more compassion.
That's a great example of how this stuff can actually play out in real life.
Yeah.
It's not just about lofty ideals. It's about how we show up in those everyday moments.
Exactly. And that's where I think the challenge lies for many of us.
Yeah.
How do we bridge the gap between the inspiration of the Sermon on the Mount and the messy reality of our lives?
It can feel overwhelming, right?
Yeah.
Like, how am I supposed to live up to these incredibly high standards?
Well, I don't think it's about achieving some kind of moral perfection.
Okay.
It's more about the journey itself.
Right.
It's about continually striving to align our hearts and minds with the values that Jesus lays out.
So it's less about reaching a destination and more about the direction we're heading.
Precisely. It's about recognizing that we're all works in progress with our own imperfections and limitations, but also an incredible capacity for growth.
You know, it makes me think of the narrow gate analogy again. It's not about whether we make it through the gate perfectly. It's about choosing that path in the first place.
That's a really insightful way to look at it, because it's in that choosing, in that constant effort to move towards love, compassion, and generosity that we truly transform.
And maybe those transformations, those individual journeys are what ultimately lead to a more just and compassionate world.
I think so. It's like those ripples you mentioned earlier. Each act of kindness, each choice to forgive, each moment of standing up for what's right, it all contributes to something bigger than ourselves.
So even if we never fully arrive,
Mhm.
even if we stumble and fall along the way, the striving itself is what matters.
Absolutely, because it's in that striving and that reaching for something higher that we discover our true potential.
We've covered a lot of ground in this deep dive into the Sermon on the Mount. It's challenged me to think about my own life in new ways.
Me too. And I hope it's been thought-provoking for you listening as well.
If you're feeling inspired, I definitely encourage you to read the full Sermon on the Mount for yourself. It's surprisingly short, but incredibly powerful.
It's a message that has resonated for centuries, and it continues to speak to us today.
It's a call to become more than we thought we could be, to build our lives on a foundation of love, compassion, and justice.
And to remember that even in a world that often feels dark and divided, each one of us has the power to make a difference.
Thanks for joining us on this deep dive. Until next time, keep seeking, keep questioning, and keep striving to build a better world, one small act of love at a time.